Actually, it's front and the mic.
All right, thanks everybody for being here. We're gonna kick off the next panel, which has to do with innovation in the vaping space. So I'm gonna let the panel introduce themselves and say who they're with and their quick background, and then we'll dive right into the subject matter. So I'm Brittani Cushman, I'll be moderating. I'm Senior Vice President of External Affairs for Turning Point Brands, and we have a National Tobacco, Vapor Beast, International Vapor Group, which includes Vaporfy and some other vapor entities, and I'll kick it off and we'll go down the row here.
My name is Jeremy West. I'm VP of Sales of CBD Effects and Mad Hatter Juice.
And I'm Chris Howard. I am General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer for E Alternative Solutions. It's a sister company of Swisher International. Before coming there, I was General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer for Blue for several years, Blue e-cigs.
My name is Brendan McDermott. I'm a CEO, co-founder, and partner at Solace Technologies.
I'm Bryan Haynes. I'm a regulatory lawyer as well. I'm a partner and head of the tobacco group at the Troutman Sanders law firm. I live in Richmond and work in Richmond and DC.
Great, so we've got a balance here of a couple business people and a couple legal-minded people. And so we're gonna start off talking about the legal landscape as it relates to innovation in the vaping space. So Bryan can come at this from an external legal viewpoint with what his clients deal with and his experience with FDA over the past 10 years almost. Mm-hmm. And Chris is in-house, so he can talk a little bit about the company experience and dealing with FDA on innovation. So Bryan, why don't you start laying the groundwork for how FDA currently treats innovation in the vaping space?
Yeah, it's not a lot of fun. Yeah, I'm a lawyer that's always prided myself on finding a way to get to yes. And that's very hard in this space because the FDA's rules make it extremely hard and expensive and time-consuming to innovate. So I end up saying a no a lot more than I would like to. You know, the rules effectively say any change requires their authority. When I say this, I want to make clear I'm talking about tobacco products here. And so there's lots of opportunities to innovate outside of tobacco products, and that's what we're seeing principally is products that are outside the FDA's jurisdiction. There's a lot of innovation going on within the FDA's jurisdiction. It's very, very hard.
And Chris, do you want to talk about it from your perspective as someone
definitely. So,
innovating with the company?
I was at Lorillard Tobacco, I'll call it the good old days, when we acquired Blue. And when we acquired Blue, it was pre-FDA oversight, and we could do almost anything we wanted. I mean, I say that from a lawyer's point of view, so it's not anything like you guys are thinking anything, but we had a lot more room. We could release new products, and we did. We had an innovation pipeline. We had all kinds of big plans for different delivery mechanisms of nicotine and things that were going to be much more satisfying to the consumer. As probably everyone in this room knows, the rule rolled out in May and subsequently became effective August 8th of 2016, and from that moment on, the harsh reality set in, and that was that we were really not able to release anything new. August 8th, 2016 was the day I started with EAS, and trying to build a pipeline out of existing products was extremely difficult, because not only could you not find anything new, but you also couldn't build anything new as well. The other thing that we found probably the most difficult is the reality of what it means to not be able to make any changes after August 8th of 2016. So we're here to talk about innovation, but I think everyone here knows that even the slightest change to your product is prohibited. And as a result, these companies, all of us, now face sort of a disadvantage compared to similarly situated companies in Europe and Asia and elsewhere, that they're continuing to move on in a very technologically and innovative industry, whereas we are sort of at a stall point, I guess.
So diving in a little bit deeper, when FDA says a new product, what does new product mean? What makes something a new product?
Yeah, just building on that point, and I'll let you guys chime in, but pretty much any change you make to a product is deemed new. A lot of people go back to the way they treated cigarettes, and you can't even change the glue in the filter paper or even an ingredient that you think makes no difference to the product. And the way we view it, I'm certainly happy to hear an alternative view, is even the slightest change, whether it's to the technology, the device itself, or the liquid, an ingredient change, a change for safety, a change to make it less attractive to kids, all of these things are forbidden in our view.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate because if you did discover an issue, you couldn't legally implement a safety-related change without going through this very time-consuming and expensive process. Yeah, I mean, you know, there's some exceptions, and you can draw on some precedents from the cigarette space. You can make label changes, for example. We're seeing a lot of that. Companies, not necessarily in this space, but in other FDA-regulated spaces, you can change labels. You're seeing some merger and acquisition activity that allows people to innovate and then change the branding. But beyond that, it's very, very hard.
So I guess the underlying point here is there don't seem to be any opportunities to innovate absent going through a pre-market authorization process at the FDA. Is that accurate?
It's pretty much the only pathway that's left. If anyone wanted to make a change to an existing product or to make a new product, you now have to submit the application and wait for FDA to ultimately provide you with the authorization to market and sell the product in the United States. Probably everyone here knows that is no easy endeavor. FDA has only ever granted one PMTA for a collection of 8 snus products, and we know that at least 300 or so of the 330-ish that have been filed recently for requests for PMTAs have been denied even in the early admissibility stage. So I think what we're facing now is a situation where, well, it's funny because they said, oh, you're going to come talk about innovation. I'm like, well, what are we going to talk about? There's going to be a very quick panel. We're faced now with the situation where even if you wanted to build something new, you could be waiting 6 or 7 years or more before you ultimately receive the authorization from FDA in the U.S.
So given that landscape, let's talk a little bit about how this affects businesses and the products we see in the market today. So Brendan and Jeremy, can you talk about how does the market in the US now differ from what you're seeing in the rest of the world, and how has the market reacted to these restrictions?
Sure. Let me first say, from any legal standpoint, these are my opinions and not the ones of my company at Solace. But ultimately, where we stand is we were early to the open bottle nicotine salt space. We were banging on doors, pushing people around, asking in every possible way, sitting outside distros, trying to explain what we believe to be the next technology. And this was prior to 8.8. Since then, as you can see in this landscape or any other show, salts have become the most popular, we'll call it the newest innovation within our space. The problem is that I'm no legal authority, as well as I'm not part of all of these companies, but being where we stood pre-August 8th, it was pretty hard to believe that all these companies were in existence before, had the proper paperwork before, et cetera, et cetera. As Chris had went on, and as Brian had touched on, other than label changes, there cannot be any change to the ingredients, the format, even the raw ingredients providers to a large extent. And this is where we have thrived, but at the same time we struggle with where the FDA is holding back. You know, there's an old saying that rules and restrictions only make honest people more honest. And the problem is that when you are honest in this space, you are harmed in many ways, and innovation is so much more possible today. To be honest with you, I don't know if that innovation would necessarily benefit the customer or not. That's not my way, but it definitely could increase sales. It definitely could increase or better the format in which somebody is provided their nicotine delivery. We have had 3 years almost now of capabilities in Europe, in Asia, in South America, in Canada to a large extent, which is opening up now, where innovation is possible. And the problem with the vapor space in particular is that innovation and technology is people all across the world look to America for that, a lot of times in Southern California specifically, and we're sitting here with handcuffs around us. And again, I wouldn't mind the handcuffs if the handcuffs were universally applied.
I think Brendan highlights probably the most frustrating part about the rule, and that is, I think most people know that FDA has been somewhat lax when it comes to enforcement of the vapor category. FDA has been very good to put the rule out there, but then with going to the next step and actually stopping the bad actors, to Brendan's point, they haven't been particularly effective. There was a day in October last year when they sent about 19 letters out to companies questioning their August 8th status, which I thought, personally thought was a promising development. But, you know, they're resource constrained like many companies. They haven't been able to move forward with that. As a result, to Brendan's point, he's faced with, and we all are faced with what I call a competitive disadvantage, because the bad actors keep coming out with the new stuff, and it puts the good companies, you know, in a real position.
So, Jeremy, talking a little bit about products that sit outside of FDA jurisdiction, what are you seeing out on the market that perhaps has a similar consumer base in many cases, but perhaps isn't under the same restrictions in the United States?
Can you kind of rephrase that? I don't understand the question really. Hold on.
Sure. So, products that aren't tobacco-derived nicotine products.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
for example, out here on the floor, we're seeing a lot of new products that perhaps we didn't see last year in the CBD space. So, what are you seeing innovation-wise there?
Yeah, I mean, the CBD space is exponentially growing. You're seeing so many new brands on the market. From a juice side perspective, you know, when this all came to the forefront, we made a lot of changes to be, you know, took away packaging, took away candy names, took away as much, you know, to make it as doled down and consumer, you know, ready with the regulations. Now with the CBD space, we've been doing it now for about 5 years. There's a huge opportunity there. I think it'll go through the same process as it has with the you know, nicotine space. We've seen a huge growth in, like we've talked about a little bit, in Europe. You know, a lot of our regulations are a little more lax there. We can, you know, launch in different countries, different flavors, still can, you know, introduce that kind of stuff. I don't know, it's, yeah.
So,
Hope I answered your question.
in other countries, is there any other place outside of countries where products have been banned in the e-liquid space that you see a similarly restrictive regime like we have in the United States, or are other markets generally more open to innovation?
They're more open to innovation. The process is a lot shorter. You can get into TPD pretty quickly, depending on the country. They definitely have their focus on the ingredients in your products. You know, we work with a lot of you know, regulatory companies out in Europe to help us guide us through those waters, and also working with our partners in those markets to develop the new products coming out.
I think it's what seems to be around the globe, and again, yes, you mentioned it as a regime. I think Chris touched on it. There are limited resources for the FDA. And I think what is important to get across is the companies that are doing this right, staying compliant, we're not adverse to the FDA. We understand this is a nicotine delivery system. We understand that regulation should apply. We understand that there is a, that we will all be better off when we get through a comprehensive guideline. The problem is the gray areas, the things that aren't clear, the interpretations of the last message or last tweet we might have responded to. But ultimately, across the globe, we find that, you know, I myself am a great patriot. I love this country. What's interesting is you'll see, yeah, we have a lot of restrictions here, but you'll see different places across the globe ban it, and then it's reopened, and then ban it, and then it's reopened. I guess that what's most troublesome in this market is that it's not clear. There's certain things that are very clear, and then you hear about other even large companies, not just in the vapor space, tobacco space, interpret that clarity on a way that no one else would interpret it. And the problem is there's nothing more than a slap on the wrist, or even that, or an opportunity to respond, which shouldn't be the case. But mostly I can say that across the globe, there's two things that seem to be the focus. One is, are they going to get their money for the taxation of it, which is fine. Make that clear, no problems, no harm, no foul. And the second thing is, how is this affecting the youth? And that seems to be the direction of what it is. TPD has been extremely clear, let's say. They had their deadlines, they didn't push it back, they didn't move it up. They enforced what it was. Again, as an innovative space, there's been loopholes, there's short fills, there's different ways of different countries. But we find, as Jeremy had touched on, you know, you're still allowed to innovate there if you stay by certain guidelines. That having been said, different countries have different rules, which seems to be focused at either A, protecting their youth a little bit more, which again we would support, or B, making sure the taxation is set up in a certain way.
So going back to, you all touched on, and I really liked, Brendan, your quote about regulation often makes honest actors more honest, and I think that's a lot of what we're seeing around FDA actions in the e-vapor space. So what proportion of the market, just, you know, from your anecdotal experience, are you seeing that seems to be products that may be considered not authorized by FDA right now?
I'm gonna pass that one to the lawyers, guys.
Yeah, I probably have a biased sample because generally folks don't hire us if they're not inclined to adhere to the regulations. So 100% of my clients are fully compliant.
But look, we shouldn't over
spoken.
sensationalize the issue, right? I mean, it's not like half the market is illegal. I don't believe that. I think there's a significant percentage. I mean, it's probably in the range of 20%. I mean, as ballparking here, just based on what we see. I mean, maybe even on this show floor, there might be some. But that's, you're really driving home the issue, is FDA doesn't have the time or the manpower to go and track these folks down and then to go take it to the next step. And really what FDA needs to do, and probably will do after they get through this exploding epidemic issue that they've created, is to really turn their attention to this 8.8 issue and really take the time to find out who the good actors are and who the bad actors are, and then start taking some real action. I mean, you guys probably know that right now, even if they could adequately enforce with their current manpower, the system they have is really also lax. I mean, in other words, it takes multiple warning letters over time before someone really gets in trouble in the retail space and in some of the other spaces. You get a lot of second chances. And I think with this issue, once they get through the youth issue and hopefully that all turns around, they'll probably have to tighten the reins a little more to get this under control. I don't think it's an immediate thing, in my opinion. I think it's going to take some time.
Yeah, and that having been said, I remember distinctly, I was in 2nd grade, I hated my teacher, right? And the most important thing I remember is this guy named John Lane would never stop making mistakes. He would never stop frustrating this teacher. And what happened every single time was we'd all get more homework, you know? I remember being at summer camp and one kid would never come home on time. So what happened is we all got our curfew moved up, right? And I feel like that's what we're facing a little bit, and it's playing to the lowest common denominator is what's happening. And the problem is that we agree in many parts, I'll speak for myself at least, with what the FDA is trying to do. Again, the problem is that they're playing whack-a-mole on the different issues, and they're not staying consistent to what they want the landscape to look like afterwards. And you know, as I said, I'll speak for myself, but if there was a comprehensive understanding, this space has done it all the way from Prop 65 to putting warnings on every single one of our bottles. If they make a deadline and a guidance, and it is clear and there is no loophole around that, we stick to it, you know, and that's what we want to do. Even the bad actors will have to stick to it because, you know, a lot of our industry, and what's so interesting is because guidance is coming in, a lot of our industry has been dominated by capitalism, right? There wasn't shrink wrap enforced, but customers demanded it, right? There's certain bottle qualities. You know, ISO certification labs have never been required in this country, but they were demanded by the customer, right? Capitalism can take us a long way, which is what I hope for, but at the same time, capitalism can oftentimes make there's a suffering group to capitalism, right? So that's why regulation is here, and we're okay with that, but there's certain guidances and certain things that are so standard protocol that we should all adhere to that the FDA hasn't even picked up on yet. But ultimately, what we're just looking for is what is the date, what are the actions, what are the guidance, and what can we do to stick to this?
So that actually sort of predicted my next question, which is if you could tweet to the commissioner and have him listen and take your advice, what would be your #1 advice on this particular issue with how the FDA should, you know, change the market for the better in terms of innovation? And it can't be no regulation.
I don't know what the word limit is on tweets because I'm not on Twitter, but I think this is
140
within
characters.
There's no point in having rules if you don't enforce them.
Yeah.
And that's the way I look at it. So again, you've got an agency that set out this extremely onerous regime for introducing products, changing them, et cetera, et cetera. Folks are spending an enormous amount of time going through the process. And then people turn around and ask me, well, Haynes, you're telling me no, but all these other people are, they're introducing new products. Why isn't that the case? So don't implement requirements if you're not going to make people adhere to them.
Well, I am a Twitter guy, but it still takes more words than I could probably do in one tweet.
The thread.
But I will try to condense it down. I mean, what would I ask for Commissioner Gottlieb to do? I mean, look, the PMTA process and the entire regulatory scheme where e-cigs now sit wasn't built for e-cigs. It wasn't built for a product that saves lives. It was built for the opposite kind of a product, for cigarettes and for combustibles and the things that are generally known as hazardous to your health. I'll focus on cigarettes in particular. Of course, e-cigs come along and they get stuck in the same rigid, onerous PMTA scheme where they clearly don't belong. And so if it were me, I would say, let's revamp that scheme. I'm not saying it shouldn't be regulated. It should still be highly regulated as part of being, what they call a tobacco product and what we now are. But the PMTA process shouldn't be A, vague, B, completely onerous and cost prohibitive, and C, right now, kind of a moving target that everyone's trying to chase. And I don't think the story is over. I don't think that it is going to end up exactly like we see it today. Most of you have probably seen the PMTA guidance. It basically says do every test possible and spend as much money as you can, and even then we won't guarantee that you're authorized. I think it will be streamlined. Someone shared with me an analogy the other day that the way FDA operates, especially with a newly regulated industry, is a lot like a pendulum. And it starts here, and you remember FDA gave the big extension on PMTAs for 4 years, and everyone was super happy, and Commissioner Gottlieb is our hero. And suddenly, a year ago or thereabouts, they come back, and now this youth epidemic issue, and we're cracking down, and we're going to pull flavors out of retail, and frankly, the whole category faces a, quote, existential threat. So now the pendulum's here. It'll swing back again, and eventually we're going to find a place where e-cigs won't be treated the exact same as cigarettes, and that's where the category needs to be.
So taking that as a segue into how this affects the public health, because that is the FDA's general mission, how does the stifling of innovation affect the public health, and are you seeing people in the public health commenting to that effect?
That's a very good question. I can't specifically speak to how it affects public health other than the studies that have been done internationally show that e-cigarettes are far better for you than cigarettes, right? I think all of us can agree that if tobacco was taken off the market, we might have a healthier nation. The thing is that we are a free country that allows for certain vices, and we pay penalties for those vices. We pay taxes for those vices. If I had understood Chris correctly, I'm not totally sure, but this came out as an alternative to smoking. This is not necessarily this is fine for you, or this is not hazardous to your health, right? The question is it better for you than what it replaces? And I think the answers have been indefinitely yes, right? Or definitely yes. The opportunity for vape, that how far it came in a certain amount of time, and that 95% of the minds in this space are not focused on what can we make better, what can we make safer, what can we make new. We're focused on how do we promote this, how do we get this business going, how do we take more, how do we do our original objective, which is convert smokers, right? And that's what it is. And I find that the FDA is in an unenviable position. That having been said, they're in a position that they also can really change what tobacco has been for the last 200-300 years in this landscape and in this culture. And it has killed millions and millions of people. But at the same time, in this country at least, we have the right to that, right? So it's an odd balance when it comes to understanding that. I find personally that flavors, that nicotine salts, that these small and discrete devices are the most effective way to get somebody to quit smoking, but at the same time, they're the easiest to abuse and hide for the youth. So it's this double-edged sword. The question that we continue to come with is how far does government get involved in that? How much responsibility comes on the company? How much responsibility comes on the culture of our society? And that's really a question that is unfortunately not the FDA's place, but also is a place that they're constantly put on. Pressure's coming on them from our side, pressure's coming on them from the parents. right? But yes, kids are getting their hands on this. The one piece of advice I could possibly give to the FDA is, honestly, stop talking about vape. And the reason for that is it's the greatest advertisement there's ever been for vape. If you remember the crack epidemic of the early 90s, the greatest advertisements they ever had was being on nighttime saying, this will kill you. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to the world. Don't go to south side of LA. You know, do not meet up with the Crips and Bloods. And what happened? Crack continued to explode, right? Again, I'm not comparing tobacco to crack. Please make that very clear. This is my lawyer. He will tell you. No, I'm kidding. But the point is, the FDA can learn from their mistakes. History has a way of repeating itself. And in this particular way, if you want the youth to stop paying attention to something, stop telling them so much of what's going to happen to them with that. The one thing I can honestly say, I know I'm going on for a while, I apologize, but the one thing I can say is what has never seemed to get across to the average consumer, to the average way, is even if vaping is 95 to 97% better for you than cigarettes, just think about how many people you know have been affected by cancers from tobacco. Right? I mean, all of us in this room have had 1, 2, maybe ourselves have been affected by the cancer caused from tobacco, right? Now, if you take that down by 97%, that's still a lot of people that suffer, a lot of cries at night, a lot of, fatherless parents, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we have to pay attention to. To answer your question directly is where's the harm reduction? It's in that 95% of people will be healthier. But remember, we started this industry to get off of nicotine, right? That's why it worked. It was get off of cigarettes, off of nicotine. But again, I don't think we can possibly tell people that they're not allowed to have their vices.
So circling back to the innovation topic, and this is a little bit of a leading question, but what are some of the problems that are out there in the market right now that can be solved through innovation that are currently being prohibited essentially by the FDA, absent going through this long and onerous marketing authorization, whether it be around battery malfunctions, whether it be around youth access and appeal? What are some of the things out there that could be fixed through innovation that aren't currently out there?
And look, you could look at that one example, and I know it's a horrific story. Most of you probably saw the news article from just last week with the first death in the United States from an exploding e-cig. I mean, it was a mod. Horrible situation. I mean, obviously, I feel for the victim and the family, but he did his part, that's for sure, to highlight just how nonsensical the inability to make changes and innovate is, because that battery came from outside of the U.S. There could have been steps taken to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen. In fact, there are plenty of products on the market that are regulated to. I shouldn't say regulated, but that are made so that can't happen. And if FDA was more engaged on this point and more open to the idea of changes to the products and innovation, we might have been able to avoid that incident. We could avoid ones moving further. So
well, I also think that people are getting clever. I mean, they're going to go out and create their own products. I mean, that's
right.
Ultimately what happened.
Right.
The guy went in and created a new mod that figured out how to rig himself. It's kind of like prohibition. If you don't let people have a way, they're going to figure it out themselves. They're going to show their friends what they just did to this existing product, but hey, I made it a lot better. Yeah. I can't get that, we can't let the professionals do it. I'll do it. And it's a lot more dangerous.
It's a great point.
Well said, yeah.
It's a great point.
Very well said. Any other examples?
Well,
what about on the youth epidemic? How can that be solved, or even partially solved through innovation?
Well, when the FDA first started talking about the deeming regulations, I know you and a lot of others engaged in a fair amount of advocacy around that. And I was saying, and I'll continue to say, I think a legitimate alternative to the pre-market review process is product standards, right? So the FDA has explicit authority to say, hey, here's how you ought to make these products. Your basic components, about whether it's battery safety, maybe something around flavors, maybe something around how you market. By the way, I'm not saying the agency should ban flavors, but if you do find certain flavors problematic, tell us, okay? You can have a standard around this. There's a process where they have to make a scientific showing to implement a standard. And most of my guys say, if you show me the rule in black and white, I'm happy to adhere to it, but I don't want to have to guess. And that, I think, is the problem that most people see. They're playing a guessing game as to exactly what the agency's expectations are when they're not always as transparent as you'd like them to be.
I'll just build on that. I think the agency is doing exactly that, and it's somewhat vague, because they're learning as they go too. And so we will go in and meet with FDA and share this concept of standards. Maybe we're talking about liquids or batteries or what have you, and they're scribbling notes away, and they are incorporating guidance from the industry. And frankly, what people in this room could do more of is to be more advocates and don't be intimidated. Get in there and talk to Director Zeller at CTP in particular, but also Commissioner Gottlieb. They are open to this sort of thing, and this whole concept of product standards is where I do think the industry ultimately goes. It's going to be a while, but the more information they have, ultimately the better.
All right, I think that's a great point to leave it on, and we can open it up.